Thank you very much. Good morning. Morning, everyone. So as you've heard from the introduction by Victor, my name is Tennyson Williams, and I'm the Director for World Animal Protection Africa Office. I think it's just fair to start by saying thank you. Thank you very much on my behalf, on behalf of my team, staff who are serving the organization from the Africa office. I want to say thank you on behalf of our senior leadership team spread around the world in all the offices where we have presence. I want to say thank you on behalf of the global leadership team, which is the most senior leadership management team. And I also want to say thank you on behalf of our global board of trustees. Friends, I think it is important to underscore that it is not always about doing the same thing and thinking you will get different results. Sometimes you really need to be bold and brave and do what is least expected. So the Protein Summit, the second in a series of summits that we hopefully will be conducting, the first being the one we did last year ahead of COP27, which was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. This is the second. We have learned, as you would expect, a number of lessons from that experience, which we hope to bring to bear on this one and in future endeavors. But more importantly is your presence, your contribution, your participation. Let me start by saying that it is also very important that we have government and government giving the support that is second to none. If government does not give support, it won't happen. So, Madam Dr. Juguna, your presence is not only symbolic, but it sends a very strong message. Because for all we know, the government of Kenya is absolutely progressive. And I think the progressive reality of the government of Kenya, perhaps if you want to have a reference point, is the Kenyan Constitution 2010, one of the most progressive around the world. So as an organization, we don't take that lightly. If government does not give you the opportunity to do things like this, you will never do it, no matter how good it is. So I want to say thank you to the Directorate of Veterinary Services of the Government of the Republic of Kenya for always, as a matter of fact, associating with the things that we do. It's not always because they agree with us. Sometimes they disagree with us. But disagreement does not amount to being outside the room. Sometimes you have to disagree and be in the room. And I think that is a very strong demonstration of good leadership, not only for us as international organizations and individuals, but I think as a continent. And I think the government of Kenya is right on top there, playing its role in trying to drive leadership for Africa. And this is one of those where new ideas, regardless of whether it's uncomfortable for the government, but the government allows the opportunity to have dialogue. I think this is a very good example. So thank you very much, Madam Dr. Juguna, for your presence. I also want to recognize Professor Catherine from the University of Nairobi. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth of the matter is we need academia. We need new knowledge. We need knowledge that is evidence-based. We need training. We need succession planning. We have to be very clear that we are preparing for the future. But the present is also part of that future. So if we don't have academia in the room, I don't think we should be celebrating. Professor Catherine, your presence is recognized, is highly appreciated on behalf of World Animal Protection, and all those who are going to be presenting. I think that we are sending a message to the young generation. You can only be worth your salt when you have something to contribute. You can only be worth your salt when you have something to contribute. And that contribution is not taken lightly. All of you in this room matters. Those online who are listening to us, who are connected to this process, your contribution matters. We are talking about the African Protein Summit. Somebody might be wondering, what is this again? Well, just hold on. Dr. Yamo, Patrick Muinde, all the presentations, including the message from the Directorate of Veterinary Services, hopefully will answer your question. Excuse me, but let me say this. The world is at crossroads. The world in which you and I live is at crossroads. One of those crossroads is a reality check presented by climate change. Before you and I were born, the climate has been there, and it has always been an issue. But I tell you, it has become more of an issue today than it was many years ago. Science has proven that, and we live with the consequences of climate change. Nobody is going to escape the effects of climate change. Whether you are in the north, whether you are in the south, it is nobody's gain to continue to do those things that only perpetuate further devastation to the environment. What we are sharing here today through the African Protein Summit is another perspective. The focus around climate change discourse has always been linked to fossil fuel. This discussion is offering us opportunity to see the problems that lead to climate change from a different lens. That lens is the contribution of animal agriculture to climate change. But let me say this, much as the global south, where you and I belong, is the recipient, the biggest recipient for that matter, of the problem, the truth is that we also contribute. Let me say that again. Much as the global south is the biggest recipient of the problem of climate change, the truth is that the global south also contributes to climate change. And therefore, it behoves us as Africans, it behoves us as the global south to contribute to the solutions to dealing with climate change. You may disagree, and I think we are up for a debate, a discussion, as long as it is about progressive endeavors to bring solutions. So please bear with us if you disagree. But even if you agree, please share your thoughts, because this is really what this is about. Before the end of this year, the world will convene in Dubai for COP28. The world convened in Sharm el-Sheikh last year for COP27. COP28 will take place in Dubai. Ahead of the world convening in Dubai, we want to begin to develop this perspective. The perspective from fossil fuel has been there for a very long time and probably has not been successful enough to put a dent on climate discourse and actions. But that does not stop new considerations to come on board. One will say, if the fossil fuel dimension to the climate discourse has not put a dent, why would you bother with a new perspective? Well, my guess is as best as yours. But I would say we will not limit our focus on trying to address the problems of climate change only from a fossil fuel perspective. And that is what, among other things, the Africa Protein Summit is about. In the next 2 days, we want to develop new ideas. We want to have a conversation and hopefully end up with a communique that can find its way to COP28. As many of you know, talking about the progressive nature of the Kenyan government, the Kenyan government is the host of the Africa Climate Week happening sometime in September this year. World leaders will gather here in Nairobi. An Africa position is likely to come out of that gathering, as it was in Gabon last year. We are hoping that the message coming out of this summit and other efforts will find its way into the Africa Climate Week and ultimately to COP28 in Dubai. Civil society, non-state actors may not have the opportunity to be in the main plenary sessions at COP28. The vehicle that we hopefully will be using is to have champion countries such as Kenya to make a representation on our perspective that we are developing. So it is very important, absolutely critical, that we have a relationship being built on trust and confidence that as citizens of Africa, we are concerned about the consequences of climate change. We want to make a contribution much as we feel the pain. We don't want to give the impression that we don't contribute to the problem. We do. And that is part of the conversation that we are beginning to develop. For you young folks especially, it is important we all have this very clear and begin to understand it and be interested as a matter of fact. So as country director for the Africa Program for World Animal Protection, I want to invite you to engage. Ask yourself the question, why am I here? Not because you have nothing else to do. You have made a conscious decision to be here because this topic matters. Climate change matters. Climate change is an issue. Let me also say this. We are not a climate expert institution. Ours is about animal welfare. So what is our business in this? In order to protect animals, in order to give animals a good life, our production systems must be responsive to good animal welfare. And for us, we believe that some of the practices do not do that. And let me be clear, world animal protection is not anti-food security. We are not saying Africa should not feed itself. That is not what we are about. We are saying that Africa can feed itself but does not need to undertake practices that cause suffering and cruelty to animals. Again, Africa can feed itself without necessarily undertaking systems and practices that cause suffering and cruelty to animals. That's our position. Again, if you disagree, I think it's okay. We can have a debate, we can have a dialogue, but Africa must not only make the case that it is at the receiving end of climate change and therefore has no business in contributing to the solutions. So without further delay, again, to colleagues who are listening online, those of you who are in the room, let's have a discussion. This is the second in a series of African protein summits that we need to hold. Our partners, our friends who subscribe to the communique that found its way to Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 last year, we are about to do the same. This time, we have to have a much more organic and all-inclusive process, learning from the lessons of last year. Hopefully, we will have a documentation that champion countries in Africa, without a doubt, can take to the floor of COP28 in Dubai to make a case for consideration that speaks to the contribution of animal agriculture to climate change. I want to thank you all very much. I look forward to the debate. Let's discuss. Let Africans drive the agenda because animal lives matter. Thank you. God bless you.
So what we'll do is, if you have questions, please note the questions. We'll have an opportunity to have an interactive session after one or two presentations, and then we'll proceed from there. So what I want to do is to then do why the Africa Protein Summit is important. And I will... Today I will not belabor the points which I usually belabor by saying that the most important slide you'll see is that one. The reason being, today we have quite a chunk of very important slides that will come. So mine is just to lay the foundation on why, as World Animal Protection, we decided to be part and lead the process around the Africa Protein Summit. So I'll start with who World Animal Protection is, and a couple of slides. One, that is our mission. Our mission is we move the world to protect animals, and they are clearly on each side of the podium here. And we here is not about World Animal Protection staffers. It's about all of us. I think Tennyson has already alluded to that. That's about all of us coming together to move the world, to protect animals, and that then leads to various facets of things that we need to be working around. Our vision is a world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering, and that's part of the reason why Africa Protein Summit is being done. And we are driven around a global strategy that was launched in 2021. So we are about 3 years into the strategy. And the strategy then has two goals. Goal one is around ensuring farmed animals live good lives by transforming the global food systems. And goal two is about stopping wild animals being cruelly exploited as commodities by changing systems that allow this. And that's part of the reason why the work that we do, and that's where we start in terms of the Africa Protein Summit being part of goal one. But the two goals are not separate. They work together, they're closely linked, because if you look at the animal feed production systems, what essentially happens is that we then go and cause some deforestation to create farms, to grow inputs that go into production systems. We also then use land, the land use policy then changes around certain things to enable us then to be able to have farms. And that whatever comes out of these farms then also has an impact on the environment in which some of these animals are living, because it contaminates if you look at manure. And in terms, when you are clearing land to then put factory farms or to input grow feed that goes into that, we are then also losing biodiversity, and we're also moving into aspects of where wild animals are supposed to be. So that becomes very critical. But since I'm only an expert in food systems then works around 3 interventions. One is No Future for Factory Farms, which is about uncovering the hidden cost of factory farming and exposing the collusion and corruption that encourage it to thrive. And we must also then know that factory farming is not necessarily the solution. I think that's a misconception, but data is beginning to show that factory farming or industrial intensive farming system is not necessarily the solution, because it then comes with other issues that we need to deal with, and that's part of the reason why we are having an African Protein Summit today. The second cluster is around, or intervention is around food revolution, which is about driving an agenda to shift to humane and sustainable food systems. And the question then we need to pose, and it will come through some of the presentations, is whether our current consumption, what our diets and what we are consuming are actually contributing to a problem, or they are meeting a humane and sustainable food system. And that is becoming critical, because then you need to look at alternative proteins and high welfare production system. And the last bit is fairer finance, where we are saying we need to drive or redirect public and private finance away from factory farms and towards humane and sustainable production systems. So in a nutshell, that's what we do at World Animal Protection, especially in aspects around global food systems. And so the next question that we then need to pose is, why then do the Africa Protein Summit? And I think the best place to start is a quote from World Health Organization that says that food lies at the heart of human ecosystem and animal health and well-being. Our health and well-being are affected by our food systems, the way we grow, we harvest, we process, we transport, we market, we consume, and dispose of food. through multiple interrelated pathways, and I think that's why it's a global food system. The reality is that today our food systems are making us ill, driving climate change and undermining the health of ecosystems and the essential services of which our health and well-being depend on. And so essentially, no lesser than World Health Organization is saying there is a problem with our food system and what we are consuming, which is impacting not only the animals that are in that food system, but also the humans that then consume these products, and also the ecosystems, the environment around which we grow these animals. In our global strategy, we talk about there is a crisis. More than 70 billion land-based farm animals are consumed annually, and most of these animals are cruelly confined in industrial, low welfare systems, what we call factory farms, or what is known as intensive livestock production systems. And that is why then we need to look at it holistically and say what is happening and what is coming through some of these processes. To then narrow it down to the African context, Africa currently, looking at 2015 figures, houses about 17% of the global population. It is expected that by 2050, that population will have doubled from 1.2 billion people to 2.4 billion people. And we need to feed these fellows. Yeah? And that's part of the challenge. Is that production system going to be sensitive? Is it a production system that is going to be giving us challenges? And I've just given you figures that are quoted. If you, young tax here who Google tech savvy, if you go online, the global meat consumption in 2018 was 360 million tons. The milk consumed was 881 million tons, according to International Dairy Federation in 2019. And eggs, we consume about 76 million tons of eggs. You can do the maths, how many eggs those were. Yeah? But essentially we are saying, remember that we are in a system where there's a growing population, and the African one you can see is going to double in a couple of years. Urbanization is taking place. All of us are moving into urban centers. The Kenyan one is even more interesting because you're creating 47 new urban centers because of the county processes. And then a lot of us then are getting more economic prosperity, and that then is shifting and driving demand towards animal products. In this country, we say that if you get to the top of the pyramid, then you stop eating the traditional foods and you start eating or consuming animal proteins. And that's what's driving some of this. Then to just make it even easier for us, we've just talked about 70 or 80 billion animals are consumed globally, and the figures are there. It's of 2018. It's projected that by 2030, there will be a 30% increase in meat consumption in Africa. Yeah? And that's why we then need to discuss where is this meat going to come from and how are we going to manage that process so that it's humane and sustainably produced. Otherwise, as will be shown in a presentation later today, we might have challenges because we'll have exhausted the resources that are required. Yeah? The production is also not any further because we are saying by 2030 there'll be a 17% increase in production of chickens. There'll be a 13% increase in pig production, and those then drive certain aspects that we then need to look at. That intensive livestock production system then has also certain negative impacts that we then need to start discussing. As Tennyson alluded to, being an animal welfare organization, our interest is the animal itself, and that's why we are saying intensive livestock production systems, and there's data around this locally generated by us and from other organizations, that system is causing suffering to billions of animals. We've just told you 70 billion of them are in confinement in systems or production systems that don't cater for their fundamental freedoms, and that becomes critical and important. But that's not the only issue. As World Health Organization said, it's also having effects on public health. We are talking about antimicrobial resistance. We are talking about pandemics. It is said that if you look at pandemics between 1940 and when the COVID pandemic started, 50% of those pandemics came from production systems. Avian influenza, swine flu, etc., etc. In terms of public health, we're also looking at residues. We're also looking at chemical residues that remain in that product. And again, data is available for that. We're also looking at disease or food poisoning that comes because either the process was contaminated or there were challenges in that production system. And so we need to relook at the whole aspects around public health because of the intensification of livestock production systems. I've already alluded to the fact that we're also having biodiversity loss and pollution because we are clearing forests to grow food, feed inputs, maize, soya, that goes into that production system. So there's definitely a biodiversity loss. But what comes out of that production system, the manure, if the farmer had used antibiotics, there'll be antimicrobial residues in manure, then that contaminates the environment. And if you're interested, later in this year, we'll be releasing a research piece that we've done with one of the research institutes around tracking some of those things. So those are things that are becoming critical. But for climate change, for this meeting, the critical thing is about climate change. It's driving climate change. Yeah? When you put animals, a lot of animals in certain production systems, deforestation leads to carbonization, which drives climate greenhouse gases. But beyond that, it's also driving methane production because intensive production systems livestock is contributing to methane and other greenhouse gases. And it's estimated that between 26 and 30% of what greenhouse gases that we see is actually coming from production systems. So that is the critical thing that we are looking at, but remember that it also looks at the other things. Last but not least, it also undermines food security. And I think we've consistently said that intensification doesn't necessarily solve our problems, but it also undermines food security, which a lot of governments are looking at. And again, there's data around that. As I conclude, the goals for this summit are: one, to raise awareness of factory farming as a climate culprit. Essentially, we are saying we want to look around, and presentations from WIND and a few people will be showing you that there is a link between intensive production systems and methane gas production and climate change. We're also saying the second goal is to influence the public and climate movement to call for a moratorium on factory farming. And that's why we are all here. And remember, in our mission, we say we go back to the we. It's about all of us being aware of what the issues are and then taking responsibility and engaging governments at certain levels, policymakers at certain levels, to then make the right decisions. We know it's not a process that will take 1 or 2 years, but we're starting that journey, and we want you to be part of that process. And last but not least is to influence policymakers and governments to publicly acknowledge and act by supporting the moratorium. And that's what we want us to look at. There are 2 meetings that we are looking at as we look at the climate change issues and from the Africa Protein Summit lens. Later in September in this country, we'll be hosting the Africa Climate Week, and that's one of the places where we need to influence what comes out of that meeting. Remember that the president of this Republic of Kenya is the one chairing the Africa Climate Week. We need to give them a message that goes to Dubai, where we'll be having the COP28 meeting, so that we are able to then drive that process around getting the messaging right and ensuring that recognition is given to the fact that agriculture contributes to climate change. And so the outcome of this meeting, and I think it was alluded to earlier on, is to develop a communique or a joint statement that will be used in engaging key stakeholders, policymakers, governments, sensitizing us as we go through the process. Last year, for those who are invited, we sent you a copy of the joint statement that we did, and it's available for you to look at. And so essentially this meeting is about driving that process, raising awareness, engaging governments and key stakeholders so that our messaging goes to Dubai for the COP28 meeting. With those few remarks, I want to end there. Thank you very much. And since I am also the MC, I want to take this opportunity to invite Dr. Jane Juguna, who's going to be making a presentation on animal protein production and consumption.
Thank you very much. As you've heard, my name is Dr. Jane Juguna. I'm a Deputy Director in the Office of the Directorate of Veterinary Services, State Department of Livestock. I may say, as for the issue of environment and climate, I may not be very conversant with them, but I'm still learning. But I'm in charge of animal welfare, communication, and veterinary advisory services, which is more or less an extension. So the issue of creating awareness comes in. When we look at the government of the core mandate of the Directorate of Veterinary Services, you know, wherever you go, you have to sell your organization so that people know that you are there, so that tomorrow you can still continue earning your salary. And it's good because that is the person who has made me stand here in front. And you can see, according to the executive order, the Directorate of Veterinary Services, what we are supposed to do, and more so management, control, and eradication of animal diseases and pests, including zoonosis. That is where we usually put animal welfare when we are managing the diseases, laboratory diagnostic services and disease surveillance, provision of facilitation of livestock advisory. You can see there is welfare and production, veterinary public health, development of veterinary farms, and the veterinary farms are also our efficacy trial centers, and also coordination of all programs. And as you well know, the DVS, or in short, Directorate of Veterinary Services, we call it DVS, is the competent authority of all matters that pertains to animal health. You can see the legal framework which we operate on, the Animal Diseases Act, all those acts. I know the one that concerns us more here is the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals Act, CAP 360. It's quite an old act, but currently the bill is there. It's already developed. It's in the process. You know, to develop an act is actually a process. So it is already out of the hands of the DBS. It's in the legal docket. We are waiting for it to finish the whole process so that it can be implemented. It's good to know about Kenya. Kenya is a unitary state, but they also have what we call the subnational levels of government. We have the counties. And the work of the national government, more or less, is to develop the policies and the regulatory framework for operations and the county governments actually deal with the implementation of these national policies and standards, and also the regulations, but they are also allowed to develop county-specific, because counties are diverse and they are specific. They cover different ecological zones, so they're also allowed to develop their own policies and legislations. The livestock subsector, which is domiciled in the agriculture, it contributes about 12% of the GDP, gross GDP of the country, and accounts for about 40% of the agricultural gross domestic product, and contributes over 40% of farm gate value of agricultural commodities. So you can imagine within the agricultural sector how big it is in Kenya. And more so within the arid and semi-arid areas. We usually say that the arable land in Kenya is only 20%. The rest 80% is arid and semi-arid. That is where the critical mass of livestock livestock farming is done, where it contributes to 90% of the livestock farming contributes to 90% of the opportunities and 95% of the family incomes. So you can see how important the livestock subsector is in Kenya. If in the 80% of the land, it contributes 95% of the family incomes. So in Kenya, the livestock subsector is such important. That's the population of the livestock. You can see 18 million cattle. We have more beef than the dairy cattle. We have the 33.7 million goats, sheep 24.8 million, 4.4 million camels, 44.6 million poultry, 1.9 donkeys, and 0.5 million pigs. And okay, that sentence is not finished, but we also have other types of livestock, but in a small number. Our production systems, we have the pastoralism, where we have most of the beef and the small stock. We also have the zero grazing, or what we are calling the intensive farming, in mostly for cattle, sheep, and goats. And we have ranches for the beef and the large dairy farmers. We also have, for the pigs, we have the large and small scale producers, and the most we have are actually the small scale producers for pigs. For poultry, we have cage, which is not all that much. So most of in our production system for poultry, it's mostly deep litter and free range for the indigenous. The animal protein production, you can see for beef, we have 650 metric tons of beef per year against a demand of 700 metric tons per year. We have for mutton 78,900 metric tons. You know, our people in Nyamachoma, they eat a lot of mutton. Then we have 16.3 metric tons of fish annually. We also have 5.2 billion liters per year, 35,000 tons of poultry meat, and 1.6 billion eggs, pieces of eggs. As for the protein consumption, it's actually similar to most of the countries. Kenya is not an exception. After all, this is Africa. We are in Africa. We almost have the similar patterns of consumption. Kenya has a much lower animal protein intake than the world average. Red meat for cattle, sheep, and goats actually constitutes 80% of the livestock-based meat in Kenya. So Kenya, we usually eat a lot of beef and mutton. This red meat comes from cattle, goats, sheep, and camels. Beef constitutes 75% of the Kenyan meat market, where consumption on average is 16 kilograms per capita. So, although some eat more than the others, but on average, a Kenyan eats 16 kilograms of meat. The annual demand for beef is 700 tons against a domestic production of 650,000 metric tons of meat per year. And most of the red meat is sourced from the areas where livestock accounts for 90% of the employment, as I had said earlier. When we go now to consumption of the various proteins, they are, as they are projected there, 16 kilograms per capita. Then we have 5.5 kilograms of mutton per capita, 110 liters of milk per person for the whole year. Again, it's the recommended of FAO, as you can see, 220 liters. Then we have fish consumption, which is 4.7, 45 eggs per person per year, and 1.31 poultry meat per capita. The rural versus the urban. Meat consumption in Kenya is mainly concentrated in the urban areas. That is where people have the purchasing power to actually purchase meat. with the two cities, that is Nairobi and Mombasa, actually accounting for 75% of the total consumption. So Nairobi and Mombasa, that's where we eat most of the meat. In the rural areas, it is, of course, the other rural towns is 25%. For instance, you can see meat traders seeking to target specific consumer groups haven't been. There is, what I wanted to indicate with this is that we may not have a lot of research carried out on meat, a lot of information, the demographics, who eats, which, is it male or female, is it the old, the young, that research, the researchers in the house, you need to do that research so that the marketers, when they are doing what we call in a business focus strategy, they can be able to know to whom they are focusing when they are developing their products. This one, although it's not very clear, it was actually to show. It was actually to show the percentages. Here it's not very clear. It was to show the percentages of the various meat that is eaten, with more being bovine. And there is a lot of milk protein. Then we have mutton. And the least is poultry meat. It's only 5%. Why I decided to show that? It's because if you look at the herbivores, they are the ones that actually contribute to a lot of methane emission. They are the ones which leave a higher carbon print in the global aspect. Meat consumption is expected to grow at 1.7%, and increasingly, scientists have raised concern about the environmental impact. That is what that's why we are here, of meat consumption, since meat production, especially on an industrial scale, as is practiced in many countries, contribute to soil erosion. It also contributes to overgrazing, expanding the carbon-based fuel consumption, because you will require a lot of transport up and down, and there is also the overuse of the water. The carbon print of plant-based meats, because right now the scientists are developing what we call the plant-based meat, is lower than that of beef and pork, and comparable actually to that of chicken and other poultry. And the carbon print of the cell-cultured meat. You see, these days now we are going industrial. We are developing meat in the laboratory. Now that meat also referred to as the lab-grown or cell-based meat is still unclear, but evidence suggests this food source will be less carbon-intensive than the beef, and will be comparable to chicken if produced with clean energy. Now, the question that we have to address is the systems that we need. Because with our country must say its GDP. Most of its GDP is contributed by the agricultural sector. For us to be food secure, according to our policies, we have to increase meat production. We have to increase livestock production. Now, vis-a-vis now, the issue of the carbon print. The question is now on us. As we now come with our communique here, what solution are we going to give to the government? What solutions are we going to give to the community? Because you remember we had a famine, drought the other day. People were hungry. For us, we need to convince these people and tell them what are the solutions for them to be food secure. This is the way we would want to go. This has less carbon imprint. It has less climate change. if we go this way. But the question that person out there in the village will ask you, then how do I make my incomes? Because to them is the issue of profits. Countries in the West have a lot of, actually they are producing enough meat for themselves and even for export. What they are producing, actually they are only consuming 50%. The rest is for export, especially the agricultural countries, the Norwegian countries. The question now here, this is Africa. Africa, we are the recipient of all the effects of climate change. We are actually suffering because of climate change. We are also having our contribution to climate change. But we are also suffering because of climate change. We want to contribute in reducing the effects of climate change. We want to farm in a sustainable way for our future generations. The question on us, which systems are we going to use as Africa? I'm telling you this because there will be an African summit. We have to convince the African governments that this is the way to go in order for us to reduce carbon print from our livestock farming. But for us, and also this is the way to go now to be food secure. With this and this, vis-a-vis this, we have to develop a communique that is going to give solutions, both for reducing the effect of climate change and for making our country's food secure. So that communique that we are going to develop has to have both the solutions if it has to be accepted. When you go to present to the government, they need, stop this, let us stop this for this purpose, but this is the solution to the problem that will be caused by what we are stopping. Because one thing that we have to accept is that this Africa, we have traditions and cultures, especially revolving livestock. Which are these practices and knowledge and attitudes can we exploit in order to reduce the climate change effects? Let us broaden our minds. Let us broaden our thinking so that when the communique is being developed, it is extensive enough. It covers the fears, it covers the advantages, it covers the benefits, all of them together. The question that is on everybody's is that if we go to the cell-based substitutes that we are talking about, because it's actually a solution, will that meat taste the way the nyama choma tastes there? Will it smell the same? Let us face it. Will I feel the same as I take that meat from the laboratory as the way I feel when we are slaughtering an animal out there? Will it even physically, will it look the same? So these are some of the discussions that we need to look at. Everything is doable. We only need to put our minds together and come up with the solution to our planet. As a government, whatever will actually reduce the effect of climate change to our country, so that we start suffering from droughts. We stop suffering from droughts. We stop suffering from floods in a sustainable way, so that we also have enough food for our population. We are welcome to implement. So it has to balance food production food security, and the other systems for reducing the effects of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yama. And I must say it's a privilege to speak after Dr. Juguna. And I'm happy, if you happen to look at the program, there are quite a number of presentations which are planned for today and tomorrow, and they're really touching on what you, some of the questions that you are posing to us. But I liked your slides on our consumption levels, how much you're consuming, and the comparison between urban and rural. And I believe we have been able to do a similar study, specifically such a study, which Dr. Am will be speaking about tomorrow. I'll be taking you through a case for a moratorium on factory farming in the Global South. And as disclaimer, it's good to be clear with what we mean when I say that. We all know we are not headed the right direction if we continue doing things as usual. And basically what you are asking for is how can we safeguard our livestock production systems in Global South, in Africa? How can we safeguard them from industrial farming systems? Because through that, we'll enhance food systems that are sustainable, and again, we'll be able to avert the climate change crisis. I don't want to speak much about this, but I thought it's good to put it there so that you are clear how we appreciate livestock production in Africa because of some key roles that they play in our lives. They are source of livelihood. You have seen from Dr. Jen's slide how many people are employed in livestock sector. Nutrition, food security. As you know, proteins come from, some of the proteins that we eat come from animals. And again, Africa, we are social. We love our culture. And you know, at some stage, we use animals to practice our culture. For example, dowry payment, and again, identity. The current status, ruminants are majority, that is cattle, sheep, goats. But monogastric, that is pigs and poultry, is growing. Most of the farming systems is owned by smallholder farmers through mixed crop and livestock farming. I have this slide, which basically shows how things have been, how they are now, and how they are projected to change up to 2050. And that is in regards to world population. You can see sub-Saharan Africa where we are. We are at the middle, the purple line, that is rising. And you can see even at 2050, it's still going up. And from that projection, it will go up for the next period, God knows when. But again, populations in Europe are plateauing. In New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand, there has not been any change. Looking at sub-Saharan Africa, and to some extent Africa, population is increasing. And with that increasing, the demand for African-sourced foods is increasing. For example, by 2050, milk consumption is expected to triple in sub-Saharan Africa. Poultry and pork products consumption is expected to more than double. With this change and this increase and this demand of animal-sourced foods, there's also going to be implication to that. For example, there is projected increase of livestock greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80%. So that we work together in this. Factory farms are also commonly known as industrial livestock farms. And I put this slide so that you get a picture of what we are talking about. These are farms which are highly intensive, they are highly incorporated, and there's a quick way to produce maximally while within the shortest time possible. So basically, animals are treated as machines. You have to produce, I'm keeping you here, you have to produce as quickly as possible so that you get to the market as quickly as possible. And because of that, there's high dependence on inputs. And when I say inputs, I mean things like feeds, like fertilizers, like pesticides, because it's all connected. To meet demand, to sustain these animals, you require animal feeds. To require these animal feeds, you have to grow. To grow these animal feeds, you have to use pesticides. For example, every year, 1.3 million tons of pesticides are used to grow crops destined for animal feeds. Of 80 billion animals that are raised annually and that are slaughtered annually, most of them, and with that I mean more than 3/4 of that, are in such kind of systems. Again, this graph here from our holding data shows what has happened, again, for the last 60 or so years. I want you to acknowledge the change on monogastrics, that is on pig and poultry. If you compare that to what has happened to other species like beef, sheep, camels, duck, and such, you can see there is a big difference from how things were in 1961 and how they are at the moment. This growth in pig and poultry industry is expected to account for the highest greenhouse gas emissions. And basically, that is because of increased demand for arable land to grow cereals. We are going to see a lot of land use change. And again, manure excretions is also going to increase. If you remember what I mentioned and what Jen presented, monogastrics population is quite low in Africa. And therefore, the concentrate that we are producing, much of it is going to human consumption and not animals. But again, things can change as the poultry and pig production increases. I know those who come from Africa, all of us here, we can relate to what is there. Some of the systems that you see in our day-to-day basis. Where a farmer has, for example, cows, then he grases those cows, or he uses maize residues, crop residues, to feed those animals. And those animals produce manure, and that manure is used to enrich crops. I mean soil for growing crops. These are the kind of systems that you can relate, systems that you see in our day-to-day basis. But what is happening? Again, there's this kind of shift which is happening. Okay, our production systems are changing. If you come from village, or if you happen to visit village, you are able to relate to the first photo to your left. Okay, where chickens have space, where chickens there are some enrichment they can patch, where there's enough ventilation, and again where there is enough sunlight, for example. But again, we are shifting. We are shifting to the photo to your right. Battery cage systems. You know this is happening. A lot of farmers are going to battery cage systems. And these are the kind of industrial farms that we are saying we have to rethink. Because, for example, if you go to Global North, some of these systems have been banned. And what they're doing, they're dumping all that to Africa. Because we are liberal, our policies are not so good, and we fancy these kind of production systems, but not knowing they're getting banned in other geographies. And also, to add into that, also the market is changing. We have seen big corporates, big businesses, for example, Carrefour and others saying by 2025, by 2030, we won't be buying eggs, for example, that are coming from battery cage systems. So when we are shifting from our traditional farming systems, we are going to systems that have no future. And I'm very sure some of you have seen some captions saying, the best farm, the best chicken farm. And when you see the kind of photo that is put there, is that of battery cage systems, okay? So for in this case, you don't care how the animal is living, so long as it's able to produce eggs economically. So basically, this is what it means that there's transitioning from low input extensive systems to high input confinement systems. Because from that battery cage systems, you have to provide everything for that bird. That is not only happening in poultry sector, it's also happening in pig sector. These are two farms. You can relate, like the one on the left. You know how pigs love behaving, routine, social, good space, and all that. And you compare with the one on the left. So basically, you can be able to relate the two photos. But what is the hidden impact of this shift? Okay. Currently, we are talking about COVID has ended, but there's a lot of warnings that we are going to have another pandemic. And previously, we have had other pandemics. For example, avian flu, swine flu, which have been associated with livestock intensification. And note that up to 60% of diseases that we have that can be passed from animals to humans come from animals. So the moment we are putting these animals in these close confinements, we are really creating ways in which pathogens might mutate and spill over to humans. Antimicrobial resistance is another key thing, commonly being called silent pandemic, because there are many deaths which are associated to it. For example, the recent science shows that up to 1.27 million die every year because of antibiotic-resistant infections. Africa is affected majorly. And the moment we are shifting our production systems, we mean we are going to use more antibiotics so that we are able to cover up the poor animal welfare issues. Animal suffering, I think I talked about that, because animals are not treated as sentient beings that they are, and they are treated as cogs of machines. I'd like to connect this somehow to climate change. And basically, climate change is a long-term shift in weather patterns. That is change in temperature, rainfalls, and some of these changes are becoming more frequent. We are seeing more floods. We have seen drought. We are seeing wildfires. These are things which we are able to relate. They're happening more frequently than they used to happen before. I try to mention that when we are growing up, our parents were able to predict, for example, rainfalls. They used to see, like, when the rain starts to, from a certain corner, very sure it's going to rain. But now things have changed. You cannot know when it's going to rain and when it's not going to rain, for example. And you can relate how farmers have been affected by that. And so that we are on the same page. All this is caused by greenhouse effect. And basically, the three key greenhouse gases, that is methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, are trapping thermal energy that is expected to go back. I try to use examples of a car. When you get to a car, you close your windows and it's sunny and you stay there. When it's quite hot, when it's sunny, you really sweat, you really feel it. And compare being in the car when it's cold. So basically, that is what climate change is doing to us, and that's how it's relatable. Looking at these greenhouse gas emissions in relation to food production, 26% of that comes from how we produce food. And of importance is to note that 1% contribution by livestock and fisheries, but most importantly, the land exchange that is happening to meet animal feeds. For example, up to 16% of land exchange that is happening globally at the moment is to create space to grow cereals that are intended to feed animals, and majorly monogastrics. This image here gives livestock greenhouse gas emissions per region and animal category. And you can see how different regions are varying in terms of the quantity and in terms of the species. For example, when you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, beef is leading. We know there's a lot of beef farming in those geographies. When you go to East and Southeast Asia, you can see chicken and pork are leading on that aspect. Sub-Saharan Africa is quite minute, but majorly the greenhouse gas emissions are from beef. Briefly, we can talk about livestock production systems in Africa. And we all agree with me, our economies in Global South, in Africa and in Kenya, are dependent on natural resources. And because of that dependence on natural resources, that means anything that affects these natural resources really affects our livelihood, really affects our survival. We contribute a small percentage to the global greenhouse gas emissions at 3%. Our livestock accounts for about 6% of that global ruminant emissions. Most of these systems, most of our production is done by small-scale farmers. For example, 70% of what we eat is coming from small-scale farmers. But again, as Dr. Jen mentioned, most of this production is happening in ASAL areas. Africa, 60% of our land is arid and semi-arid, and that is expected to expand, to grow, as climate change continues to increase. And don't forget, there's intergenerational land subdivision. For example, the land that my father had is going to be divided among his children, and I believe that is happening to most of us here. So you can imagine. So the lands are becoming smaller than they were years ago. They are majorly extensive, and majorly animals are fed on forage-based diets. And basically by doing that, you're converting inedible refuges into meat or milk. So basically you're making what is not edible to humans to be edible by passing it through ruminants. Most of our markets are localized, and most of our inputs are localized. So it means there's no long-distance transport that is incurred. There's minimized fertilizer use because forage-based diets that you use, grazing that you use, there's quite minimal cereal supplementation. So why a case for a moratorium? And basically, when we say moratorium, we're asking, can we take a step back? Can we rethink about our production systems? Can we see how we can protect and nurture what we have so that it's able to feed us into the future? And factory farms, which is getting adopted, which is coming to Africa, are shown to depend highly on grain diets. And as I mentioned, there's high utilization of fertilizers and agrochemicals. And just think how some of events that we're having globally are affecting demand and supply chains. For example, the war in Ukraine. You can see how wheat, cereals, and such kind of products are really affected by that. So Africa, if we continue depending on global north or other systems outside Africa, if anything happens in those countries, you'll be adversely affected. You can relate with the COVID vaccines, what happens to COVID vaccines. When the outbreak started, countries were fighting for their citizens. Okay? And there are quite a number of projections on how Global South is going to be affected. And there was a lot of debate through the African Union pushing for Africans to get vaccines. So that is the same approach that we should use when it comes to producing our food. Conversion of forested areas to create space for cereal production is happening. For example, in Global North, a feed accounts as high as 30% of emissions, compared to less than 1% in Kenya, a Global South country. And I thought this is important to indicate that how animals are inherent, are not so efficient in converting concentrate into animal source foods. For example, for every 100 calories of crops that you feed to farm animals, you only get 17 to that of that. That is what you get either through milk or through meat. With all that, what is the way forward? How do we need to go into the future? And we'll start with the UN statement that it recommends that government subsidies to intensive agricultural systems need to be redirected to agroecological food systems. And that's the same position that you have in as animal protection. If you follow Dr. Yamo's presentation about fairer finance, we're asking, can we focus, can we support our systems? Because as you know, most of the times, as much as these small-scale farmers are producing 70% of what we eat, they are neglected by the governments. No one is supporting them. Just imagine how they can be able to change things if they get support that they have been asking all along. Because that will help them contribute significantly and have a better footing when it comes to food value chains. Small-scale farming, the products, those kind of food systems are more localized, and therefore we are more connected to what we eat, and we are conscious of how that food is produced. And we are asking producers to adopt farms initiative. Basically, those are responsible minimum standards, which are based on a range of standards from international frameworks, from OI chapter on animal welfare in terrestrial animal health, and also IFC's good practice note. And basically, we are talking about spacing allowance, stocking density, having an environmental enrichment, and all that. You believe me, these are the kind of things that it will be so hard to implement when you adopt factory farming models. That is why we're having this conversation, and I hope it has been clear to you. And there's a report that has been shared. Some of you have seen it. That report is what I've summarized here, and it is what formed the basis of last year's Africa Protein Summit communique or joint statement, and is what we are looking forward to add into today and tomorrow's discussions. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Yamo to welcome his colleague to take the next presentation.
It's a pleasure to be here. I am Angel Flores. I am from the Philippines. I am part of the International External Affairs team. As mentioned by Dr. Yamo, I'll be talking about another research that World Animal Protection recently produced, which is around the top 5 meat producers around the world and looking at their footprint. So earlier when Tennyson made his remarks, he said that in the climate arena, we often hear about fossil fuels, the impact of these different fossil fuel companies, but we hardly hear about a discussion around the impact of meat production companies, the largest ones. So they are also high-emitting companies. They are also polluters. And as we've seen in many scientific research coming out, we have a very narrow window of opportunity left to us to really deal with the climate crisis. And the reality is that climate change doesn't have any borders. So wherever we are, my country included, the Philippines, is also a very climate vulnerable country. And hence, action in different countries, as Tennyson also mentioned, every contribution matters. So allow me now to talk about this research that we had. And really it was honing on the factory farming companies across the globe. I mean, the largest ones across the globe, so they're the top 5 ones. And let me now move on to that. So, we're going to cover in this presentation what the scorecard is about, why has it been developed, and why now? How did we develop it? We'll also discuss the key findings and what does it mean for companies, the UNFCCC or the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, and what are we asking of governments? So what is the scorecard? So we have identified the world's largest chicken and pork meat processing companies and ranked them based on their emissions, which you will see on this slide. As you will see, many of the companies there are associated with one company called JBS. And JBS is a factory farming giant that slaughters more animals than any other company globally. You will also see on this slide that factory farming is happening in different hotspots across the globe, in the US, in Mexico, Brazil, in Europe, in China. And earlier, we've heard from Dr. Jane, from Dr. Yamo, and from Dr. Munde that the prospects or what we're seeing into the future is that there is going to be a growing consumption and demand. So why are we doing this? Why the scorecard? And why do we care? So, well, we want a deeper understanding of factory farming greenhouse gas emissions that come from the food systems, particularly from factory farming giants. Secondly, we aim to understand and highlight those companies' effects on habitats and the climate. I think they've probably had a free pass for a long time. All activists and campaigners often would see, oh, we want to kick the big polluters out. Fossil fuel companies, we want you out. But no one is raising their voice against these factory farming giants. And what we've seen at COP27 last year, that actually the number of lobbyists that comes from the agribusiness sector is growing year on year. Third, we're also very conscious that many companies have net zero commitments. So these net zero commitments are their own targets on when they intend to be climate safe, or net zero, meaning their emissions are no longer harmful, or it doesn't reach a level that's harming the planet. And because of those commitments, we are very keen to hold them into account. So our key focus is exposing the damage done, especially by animal feed production. We've also heard that several times today, that this animal feed production is fueling that climate change and GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions footprint, by destroying habitats as well as clearing lands and so on. And this work is also building on an earlier report that World Animal Protection produced called Climate Change and Cruelty, which looked at 4 factory farming hotspots globally. That's Brazil, China, the Netherlands, and the US. So you might ask, why now? Why is this the perfect time to talk about this topic? So last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, that's the scientific body that guides the discussions and the debate when it comes to the climate negotiations. They actually released a study, or their report, which strongly identifies dietary shifts as key climate mitigation opportunity. So they were also very clear that the food system's emissions, even if we stopped fossil fuels immediately, without taking making any transformations within food systems, the Paris Agreement goals will remain out of reach. So what we're trying to say here that there's no silver bullet when thinking about solutions to climate change. And I think Dr. Jane alluded to that in her presentation this morning. We must put our minds together. That's her message. And hopefully we'll be able to do that by the end of the two-day summit. So also, last year, another development, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, they released guidance for addressing land-based emissions. So you might be asking, what is the SBTI? So it's this body that holds companies into account when it comes to their net zero commitments. So how did we develop the scorecard? As said earlier, the 5 biggest companies, we identified them, and we focused on pork and chicken meat production, which later I'll also tell you why. So we used the production data in annual reports of these companies, as well as consolidated industry reports. Second, we calculated the emissions per kilogram of chicken or pork meat for each of those companies. And then we calculated the proportion of overall emissions for each company looking at animal feed production. As said earlier, animal feed production is a large contributor to these emissions. And fourth, we compare these emissions to the number of cars on the road, and this comparison was made in order for it to be more easily be comprehensible and visualized by the common public. And finally, we also asked companies for data. To be fair and to have a balanced conversation and dialogue with them, we gave them an opportunity to respond to the findings as well as to give us further data. So here are the key findings. So we found that the world's 5 biggest companies in factory farming of chicken and pork slaughtered around 150 million pigs every year and 11.5 billion chickens. So this production equates to the carbon emissions, GHG emissions of 36.4 million cars on the road annually. So this is a number that's larger than all the number of cars on the road of New York City, Rio, Beijing, and Denmark. And we are only talking about just the 5 companies, and we know all over the globe there are more of them. More than half of those emissions come from animal feed. And that footprint is, of course, closely linked to deforestation. We've also heard earlier that through deforestation where carbon is released and land is cleared and habitats are destroyed. So this animal feed production that we see, which constitutes the larger part of the emissions, is equal to like 7.8 million cars on the road annually. And it underwrites factory farming, cheap meat, and as well as the suffering of farmed and wild animals. And that's why we are here and raising our voice around the issue of factory farming across the globe. So most agricultural land is not used for grazing, it's used for animal feed. So given what we know and what we see from these just 5 companies, we would like companies to actually take the following actions. First is that if companies can publicly release credible policies to end habitat destruction in animal feed sourcing without delay. Second if they can report publicly and transparently on emissions across their businesses by setting robust and transparent emissions reduction plans that account for scopes 1, 2, and 3, really meaning that accounting for all the emissions within their supply chain. So not just from the production within the factory farming itself, but the pre-production processes of clearing land, clearing land for animal feed, and so on. And finally, we'd like them to stop producing more and more, and I'd like to emphasize more and more factory farmed meat and dairy. So we're not saying no to like high animal welfare, which has been discussed earlier. We're saying we don't like more factory farmed meat and dairy, which has a large climate footprint as well as environmental and health consequences. Instead, we'd like them to produce more plant-based foods and ensure animal products that are high welfare. So, for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, what do we want to tell them through our report? That agricultural emissions need to be urgently addressed alongside fossil fuels. This is in order to reach the Paris Agreement goals. We'd like them to also recognize that aside from factory farming being a huge component, the animal feed production is also a large part of that. And again, just driving the point earlier that this research only looks at 5 companies, and there are more out there, more than just these 5 companies which we consider climate culprits that are operating out there. Food systems need to change to humane and sustainable systems. What that would look like, definitely, it's a conversation, it's a national conversation that needs to be had, depending on the context and the appropriateness of solutions. Earlier, we've heard from Dr. Munde, the proposal for a moratorium on factory farming. That's also one of our key asks. And finally, civil society representation, especially those that are most marginalized, including smallholders and small-scale fishers, is essential. So what do we want governments to do? So there are these incremental steps. First is that for governments to acknowledge or recognize the link between climate and environmental damage and footprints of factory farming. Second, tightening regulations on deforestation and imports, and strengthening animal welfare standards and environmental regulations. Third is to encourage plant-based diet diversification. Earlier, there was this question also posed by Dr. Jane around how do we become food secure? Where will that protein come from if it will not come from the animals themselves? She has touched on the important emerging debate around cell-based meat. So those are some of the things, again, context-based and looking at a variety of solutions out there that needs to be considered. Fourth, it's also catalyzing the reduction of meat consumption and adjust protein transition. So looking at this demand side of things and looking at consumption behaviors. And of course, we want to see this first from the high meat consuming countries because of their large appetites for meat. If they can curb that to the standards set by the WHO, that would really be a big help in terms of mitigation. Finally, commitments. So in the UNFCCC, countries submit what we call the nationally determined contributions, and this outlines the different aspects where countries would like to either mitigate or adapt to climate change, and they can include or enhance their ambitions when it comes to the agricultural related commitments, and we'd like to see some form of commitment that will help cap the footprint of factory farming at its current level or reduce its footprint. And the long-term view is that transition out of land-intensive sectors altogether. So there, I've placed a QR code there where you can access the full report if you're interested. And then, yeah, be happy to take in questions later. Thank you.
As you can see, there's a lot there. And so the debate keeps going. So she's talked about what we're expecting corporates to do. She's highlighted what we're expecting governments to do. And she's also highlighted at certain levels what we expect the rest of us to do as part of consumers, etc., etc. I think it's a good point to then have questions. And as we wait for questions from the floor, I want to read one or two comments that are coming from out there, the people who are digital. Currently, I'm being told there are 105 participants digitally from a series of countries, which includes Kenya, Uganda, South Africa. Lucy will update me on that one. Jane, you've done well, because I can see Dr. Mwangi Kiai saying, excellent presentation, articulation with this subject with an African perspective in mind. There's also Dr. Jane Omani. I think I know Omani from another level. I was talking about a phenomenal presentation. There's Charles Sekeiwa from Uganda, who says there are alternatives to intensive animal husbandry. Small ruminants can be kept in a sustainable way to help to reduce emissions from factory farms. He also indicates at a certain level that the presentation is very true. Even in Uganda, there's that misinformation that factory farms are more advanced and better. We need to have attitude change, very key. I can see my classmate, Faizel Guhad, asking about consumption. Jane talks about 16 kilos against 43 kilos. So what do we need to do? Should we eat more meat or less meat, etc.? I think we can answer that at some point. And then there's also an assumption that, Charles again Sekeiwa says there's an assumption that people care about what they eat in terms of quality. There's a serious need to create consumer awareness. So those are some of the comments coming from online. We will try to address all of them. But if there's any question here, please, this is your opportunity. You know, it's everything except fish. Yeah, and I think that's the challenge we have here. It's a question of what we're eating. Jane talked about 16 kilos. 16 kilos per person per year in Kenya. But your biggest meat consumed in this country is beef. Yeah? Globally, the biggest meat consumed is either chicken or pigs. And that's where, if I remember my data well, I think in Kenya, meat consumption is 2% chicken and 3% pigs or something around that side. Jen is nodding, so I must be right. Yeah? If you look at other markets, when you say globally it's 40 kilograms per person, there are places where it's way beyond 40 kilos. If you look at the Americas, we're looking at about 86 kilos per person per year. If you look at Europe, it's about 76 kilos per person per year. In Africa, the biggest consumer is South Africa at about 56 kilos per person per year. So that's what we are dealing with. And in a presentation later on, they'll be telling you about meat exhaustion. If we continue at that level, are we going to be able to sustain ourselves? And that's why we are talking about a humane and sustainable production system and consumption, because the two go hand in hand. Having said that, then the question that Faisal, my classmate, asked, are we saying we should eat less meat or more meat? No, it's about protein consumption. And I think that's why we are talking about protein. Your source of protein is not only meat. I think that's a mistake that you're making here. There are other alternatives, and Professor is here and a few nutritionists. Because of the nature of work I do these days, I have nutritionist friends that tell me, in fact, what you're eating is way above what is recommended, even at 16 kilos. So we need to go back to the math and say, what are the alternatives? You've heard that if you continue producing meat the way we are producing it, we might not have enough water. because water is a stress factor globally. In fact, the amount of water that's available for production and consumption will end ahead of the capacity to produce meat. So we need to look at all these things holistically, or we will suffer. And that's why we are then having the protein summit, because we also want to raise, and I'll be talking about it tomorrow. When we did a CAP survey in Kenya, the assumption is that you have to eat meat to meet your protein requirements, which is a bit unfortunate. And it's more interesting that that assumption is on the learned Kenyans. We still don't remember our balanced diet from school where we were. So that's part of the challenge that we need to be addressing. And so we are not saying don't eat meat. We are saying that we need to look at the whole meat consumption holistically and then factor that meat consumption into the discussion around protein consumption, because maybe your nutrition policy is even saying that you should not be eating that much meat, and the Kenyans don't read their policies, and that's the discussion we want to have. I think I'd want to stop it there, so that we give an opportunity for the next set of presenters, and I will invite my good friend to set it up, and now we're going to hear from our learned friend. Our learned friend, Judy Mureithi, will be talking about, let me just confirm, we'll be talking about environmental and social impacts of selected poultry farms within Nairobi metropolitan area.
Thank you very much. Today I'll be talking about the environmental and social impacts of poultry farms within the metropolitan area in Kenya, Nairobi. Why we took this project was just to analyze how much protein or how much protein is taken in Nairobi, and how are the farms, where do we get our meat? Do we get the meat from the large-scale farmers? Do we get the meat from the small-scale farmers? And if indeed you're taking the meat from the large-scale farmers, what kind of conditions are the meat grown? Or if it's the small-scale farmers, what conditions are the farms in? And so it was quite an interesting project, as we were able to analyze and see the perceptions by farmers, perception by the consumers and the community surrounding the farms. What do they perceive, or what do they like about the farms, and what kind of benefit do they think they have on the farms themselves? And you know, in Kenya, poultry farming has been continually increasing over the years, and will stand to increase as we continually increase in population in Kenya itself. If we do a standard search, Google search, if we say, what is a typical poultry farm in Kenya, and you'll see the kind of farms we have. And if you can see there's Tukonis, there's Victor Matara, who's a farmer, and you can see the list of the best poultry companies. If you click on that link, you'll see the kind of system that they're trying to advocate in Kenya, and it's quite intensive, as you can see from the farms, from the pictures. And so, for you to start a poultry farm in Kenya, there are specific regulatory compliance that you need to undertake. You need to do faster an environmental impact assessment, which is supposed to analyze the kind of climatic impacts that the farm might have. This will include the communities around. When you do a public meeting with the people to see what they anticipate, what kind of social impacts does it have, economic and the political in the area. And once you do the report, once it's assessed, and then you're given a license. And every year you're supposed to do an annual environmental audit as per the environmental acts that we have in our country. And also in all those farms, we need to check the public health compliance. Do we comply with the public health of the country? How are the people who are handling the animals? How is the community? How are the animals themselves? And also, all these farms, they have affluents. How are we discharging the affluents? Are they compliant with the environment? Yeah. And so when we were doing the research, we checked the monitoring indicators we checked was the air quality, the noise pollution, the erosion control measures. You know, we are emitting, we are removing most of the waste. And so we need to see how much erosions are caused by the chemicals and everything in the farms. Also, we have the occupational health measures of the workers. How are the workers inside the farms? The animal welfare, the community health, waste management, the number of staffs, how many staffs are there? Are they proportionate to the animals and the size of the land? Those are kind of the things that we're checking in the farms. We went around 10 farms, and the farms were mixed. Some of them were large, others were small. Our initial suggestion was to take the large farms, but then you notice that we were not quite getting the crux of the industry itself, because as we know, most of our poultry we get from the small farmers, and so we felt that we needed to include the small farmers in the analysis. And so what we were checking basically was the licenses, the initial production, or rather the initial establishment of the farm, and how many people are there, and what kind of practices that they are undertaking in their farms. Another things that we saw was the air quality, how much ammonia was there, how much methane, and how much nitrous oxide was being released in the farms, and how it affected directly to the other people. And then you know that in terms of the cost of analyzing this specific aspect of it, it's not so high, but usually have the NEMA who come and then survey the area, then they analyze and see how much emissions are there. And then in these terms, and you remember when you're doing the EIA, we need to come up with specific, like we need to have a specific level of management of the farm. And if any negative aspect of the farm that if it comes about when you're continuing with the production, you need to come up with mitigation measures for which you're supposed to employ once any negative effect comes up. And that's why we need to have annual environmental audits to ensure that we are always compliant to that standard that we've put. Also, we checked the solid waste. And also, you see, when you're doing the AIA, we need to get all these licenses. When you check the solid waste, that specific compliance, it's around 20,000 shillings. And as we continue with the presentation, I want us to all add up how much money is needed to have a typical kind of farm, so to be able to see, is it really sustainable in terms of the cost, and why are farmers not complying with all this compliance? Okay. So the first cost we're going to indicate right now is 20,000 shillings, which is basically for the research on the waste that is going to be removed from the farm's production systems. And then also we have the flies. The flies definitely they come about because of the production system of that specific farms. And if you know the flies, they can be oh wait, I can't even see up here, sorry. Okay, I've cut it, but I'll send the presentation. But anyway, flies, they come about because of the droppings of the poultry, and it can have very adverse effects to the employers, the communities, and the animals themselves. And so it's done throughout the life of the production. And then to get the specific certificate, you need 30,000 Kenya shillings. Okay. Then next we check the occupational hazards and injuries to the workers. What kind of machines do we have? Are they friendly to the workers? And if at all there's a specific policy in terms of this, what happens when a worker has been hurt? What kind of measures do we take? And even the animals themselves, once there's an injury in the animals, what do we do? And so every year we need to do continuous trainings for the staff and the project engineers and everyone there. And so we need to have the affluent parameters, which is just indicated under this. Because you see, if the air quality or the quality of the farms are not okay, then that means the health of the workers already will be affected. So that whole study that actually happens annually takes around 70,000 shillings, because we have the 20,000 shillings for the affluent parameter monitoring, and there's the training for the staff. And the training for the staff, that's just give the minimum, or rather the average of different farms. That's already 70,000, okay? So we have 20, we have 30, and we have 70. We're already at 120,000 shillings every year, okay? And then also we have the storm water generation. We know we need water for every farm, as you've heard from the various speakers. We need water to sustain the farms. So, and every year, definitely we need to ensure that we continually test and we ensure that the equipments are correct. Like, is it there's a routine maintenance. So how much are we going to spend? On average, we might spend around 40,000 shillings, or sometimes even spend around 30,000 shillings, depending on how big it is and how many people are there. And you remember, the people inside the farms, they have to wear the kits. Remember, we have doctors here, we have the kits, we have all these things that we use so that come out to reduce the number of diseases from the farmers and the animals. That can cost maybe around 300,000 per year. That is because you have to change every day. You can't recycle the PPEs. We're still calculating, right? It's already at for 70,000 shillings, thereabouts. And then we have the possible conflicts. That may not cost a lot of money, because you're just getting a kamkunji, where you get the communities. We sit down and then we try and calculate and see what kind of benefit. Because most of the cases, most businesses give benefit to the community, because we have employment and we have the food itself. So at this time, I think it would be around, because that's 470,000 shillings, thereabouts on average. So that's how much a typical farm would normally require. That's on the bare minimum. So as the farm becomes bigger and bigger, the costs continue accruing, and they become even more. Okay, this is something we need to think about as we proceed with the presentation. Okay, so from the farms that we visited, the 10 of them, only 2 farms were compliant in terms of the audits and the licenses. We've seen the cost. The cost has already amounted to around 470,000 on average. That shows that for every farm, that's how much money they should have spent. And you remember, when you talk about the farmers, they are continually increasing the profits and minimizing the cost of production. And if they can reduce or even forgo some specific costs, they'll rather do that than even using the cost. And as one, we noticed, what we noticed the most was that the large farmers, we have Kenshik on their big farmer, they're one of the leading poultry farmers in the country, and they were compliant in all aspects. In terms of AIA, all the licenses, everyone was trained, all the PPEs, all of them were trained. But what you noticed in these small farmers was that even something basic like the PPEs, they were non-existent in the farms. As you remember, the smallholders, just maybe you and me, just say, tomorrow I want to have a farm. So how much money do I need? I need 10,000 shillings. You only think about how much money is it in terms of feeds and the layers themselves. People don't really put much thought in how much money that is needed in terms of the compliance and the checks that is needed from the animal. And definitely that goes directly into the animal welfare standards of that specific farm. Let's remember that also in terms of how much care it's taken by these animals. Okay, yeah. So we can see like this specifically, this farm 1. You can see the animals are just 1,200 animals, live birds, and here there was no complaint with anything whatsoever. But you can see they sell to restaurants. The question that dietary always asks: do you know where your meat is coming from? Have you ever asked yourself where your meat is coming from and try to investigate further and see that was the animal under good welfare conditions? Were they exposed to any biosecurity hazards? But sometimes we never really do that, and so that's something that you need to be thinking about. Yeah, and as I said, there's a farm here which had around 50,000 birds. That was one of the Kenshik outlets where they were compliant with everything. And you can see what is very interesting about the whole thing is that in Kenya, we have 80% of the poultry comes from the smallholders, but there's no surveillance. And so there's this thing that you'll even notice is that the big farms comply. But then why exactly are we not able to get the farms directly from the big farmers? That's a question we should be asking ourselves. But it's all about the availability in the market, because most of them they use them for the exports. As you can see, with the big airlines, the big hotels, but the small holders, just our normal neighbors. So we would rather support the neighbor, so we'll just go take from the neighbor. So it's one of the things that we will see. And then on the studies, also you have to remember still that even with these small farms, another thing that we noticed was that these small farms, they are based on demand. So today, it might be a farm with poultry. Tomorrow I'll go back, they say, that wasn't profitable. I changed and then said selling cows. Next, they say, I said selling pigs. So you see, even in terms of changing, they're actually just picking and choosing whatever is more profitable at the time. Okay? Yeah, so the environmental, so the reasons of non-compliance definitely was a cost, as I had said before, what's about the costs. And then policy strategies are not proactive. And so people are not exposed to these kind of laws, and they do not know that actually they can say, this is wrong. We can have an outcry towards a specific farm. That's in terms of the bad air quality, the affluence, and the poisoning of water, or rather the affluent going to our water. People really don't know whether they can actually protest against it. And also there's limited staff too for enforcement. Because now if there's no one to check around, then I will just take that easy route because no one is going to hold me accountable for that. And then another one will be the public health personnel ability to respond is filled in lack of knowledge, because now, even though the vets want to respond, but then the people themselves, they don't have the resources to do that, to ensure that they actually come. Because I believe that it will be easier if a farmer has a specific vet who comes regularly, every single time, every I don't know how often it can be, maybe as often as possible, so be able to anticipate and know these kind of things. And then we have the recommendation, production producers. So the production themselves need to be aware of the repercussions, or rather they need to see the link between public health and animal production. You remember we had COVID, and so at least now with COVID, you're able to see the linkage between the public health and the animal. How we treat animals is directly related to what we get afterwards. If we put garbage in, garbage out. Always remember that, garbage in, garbage out. So once the producers are able to understand that and see that they can be able to control the production system and come up with more sustainable systems, then becomes a very good way. And also, as we've heard from all the speakers, we need to educate and bring in more resources for which we can ensure that we have more sustainable ways of growing the animals. Are the animals safe? Do all the farmers know about the animal welfare standards? So the kind of things that's a good recommendation for that. And then there's the consumer behavior. Consumers always believe that whatever they get on the market, they're conditioned by the government. Like they usually believe that as long as something is in the market, the government is actually accepted. So that means we need to start ensuring, bring in educational programs that ensure that consumers understand that the government is the forerunner, but they can hold the government accountable in terms of the products that they give us, and ensure, especially that aspect of enforcement. How can the consumer ensure that the government implements and enforces? Such are the things that we need to do in terms of the consumer, and we need to come up with more programs to ensure that the consumer knows where the meat is, and they're able to have a platform where they can voice and ask where the meat is. And so policymakers is everyone. We have the academia, we have the government itself, but the government holds the biggest role in this as the policymakers. They need to come up with specific laws that ensure that we have sustainable production. And with governments, we need to ensure that for even investments, they all comply with the farm standards. And so with this, it becomes even easier for the consumers, whatever they eat, it's sanctioned by the government based on the good welfare standards. And also, all the policies need to be proactive, as we've heard from various speakers, is that Africa, we have the biggest effect of the climate change. So then we should have food systems that mitigate, or rather come up with ways that reduce or mitigate. Yes, we have to be very developed, but then even in the line of development, we need to come up with ways that are not really increased into. Let us come up with sustainable, more natural based. So let's look for more natural based solutions in terms of the poultry production. Yeah, I think that's it. Let's know if we have any questions.
Just like we did before, James is suggesting we clap. So please clap for Judy. Thank you, James. Yeah. Now you see the visitors are leading us, one. You people, you're letting me down. Anyway, now we want to be a bit more technical, or high-tech, not technical. So the next two presentations will be digitally done. And so the next presentation is going to come from Esther Omosa and Zoe Campbell from International Livestock Research Institute. I must apologize that they were online at the time they were supposed to present, unfortunately, because of the ongoing processes. The host is sitting somewhere and we are sitting somewhere. We didn't recognize that they were there. So Zoe or Esther, whoever is presenting, just share your screen and you can make the presentation. The presentation is about livestock for better nutrition, research lessons from East Africa. Over to you, Zoe or Esther.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening if you're joining from somewhere far away. So my colleague Esther and I are actually going to be presenting this one together, but I'll start us off and then I'll pass the torch to her. Let me see if it can let me share my screen well. So actually, I'm smiling here. Both Esther and I are joining from Nairobi, but I'm smiling because Dr. Njuguna actually gave us a mandate. She said, I wish some researchers could open up the roof of a home and figure out who in that home is eating meat. And actually, that's something that we have done. So we'll get to respond to that request. I am having a hard time sharing. There we go. Great. So as I said, my name is Dr. Zoe Campbell, and my colleague Esther and I are going to talk a little bit about nutrition in the livestock context. So instead of some statistics, we have a few of those. I think others have set the scene really well for thinking about livestock in East Africa and in the African continent. So we're going to skip over those and actually tell two research-based stories from recent projects that we've worked on at ILRI. So in case maybe not all are familiar, ILRI is the International Livestock Research Institute. We have our main headquarters here in Nairobi for those of you who are here, and also in Addis in Ethiopia, and then some other offices in other parts of the world. And mainly what we do is research about livestock. And more specifically, because livestock can be quite complex, there are lots of different things that we might think about. So some of them overlap really well with the goals of this conference, thinking about, for example, animal welfare and climate change, animal source foods, or accessing markets, or whether they're able to participate in the economic opportunities from livestock. So those are some of the things that ILRI works on generally. I'm going to skip these because I think that they've been covered well by others. As others have shared, I think the one piece about, as everyone has discussed, about thinking about livestock in the global south is recognizing that most of the livestock are still living, right? And being controlled by very small enterprises, right? Small businesses, household businesses, small farms. They may be intensifying, they may have feed, they may have varying levels of veterinary care, but again, if we look at the African continent, that's 72% of livestock produced by small farms. So that's a very different picture from, again, some of the models of the global north. So I was saying, to set the scene for my colleague Esther is going to talk about nutrition. Another thing that we think about at ILRI is the idea that access to animal source foods for a certain subset of the population can be very, very important. And so I think as we're looking at have a lot of access to alternative foods. And so for this subset of the population, animal source foods can be very important. Another thing that we think about, another twist, is I was thinking that at ILRI, many of our development type interventions that we would do research around are looking at encouraging intensification, but encouraging for people who have relatively modest numbers of livestock, and even if they do intensify, may actually still be considered smallholder farmers. So this isn't the intensification to become a factory farm, but this would be maybe moving from keeping 20 chickens as a household asset to keeping maybe 2,000 chickens and being able to sell them. And in these scenarios, we're actually very interested in the gender piece, because about half of livestock farmers are women, and their access to veterinary services, their access to markets, their ability to benefit from livestock economically can be really different from their male counterparts. So for some of the interventions that we talked about, and as we encourage intensification, again, there are a lot of different issues, right? The climate change issues can come up, the commercialization, but also we think about well-being of people and their economic lives as they engage with livestock. And finally, I think others have touched on this as well, but the types of livestock emissions are very different, again, in different parts of the world. So it is important also to consider that as we're thinking about global solutions and what might make sense in different places. With that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Esther, and she's going to describe a project in Rwanda and talk a little bit more about nutrition.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everyone. Zoe, I request that you move the slides because you're controlling them from your end.
Of course.
So next, we are going to share a few of the pathways, some of the lessons that we've learned while implementing livestock keeping projects or interventions in East Africa. And the first case we'll do is a case of Rwanda. But first, before we go there, we do have some livestock keeping to nutrition impact pathways, which are the pathways that we think that producing livestock then would lead to improved nutrition and food security more generally. So we will present about 4 main pathways through which livestock contributes to improved human health and nutrition. And we do have one that shows the negative impacts of livestock keeping in human nutrition and health. So the first pathway is where we say that when farmers or producers produce the food, then they consume the animal source products. So for example, a farmer keeps livestock, dairy farm animal, and they get the milk directly from there. So by consuming the milk directly from the dairy cow or goat that they keep, then it contributes into improved nutrition. So this is called the own consumption pathway or the production pathway. The other pathway is whereby they produce and sell either the whole livestock or they sell livestock derived foods and get the income from there. And then use the income to purchase either animal source foods or other non-animal source foods that contribute to improved nutrition. And the income pathway also emphasizes that the income from livestock, while it may not purchase food directly, it can purchase non-food purchases that are or items that are beneficial for nutrition. So for example, the income can be used to seek medical services that ultimately contribute to improved nutrition and health, or pay for education, because we know education has a positive correlation with better health and nutrition, all factors constant. The other pathway is the women empowerment pathway, and this we see it more so in the small livestock or small ruminants, whereby women have a joint decision making or more control on the livestock itself and the produce that comes from it. So if they have control over what to purchase or even to sell the livestock or the products and the benefits that come out of it, then they can use that to either purchase or prepare healthy foods that contribute positively to nutrition. And we say evidence has shown that when income is more in the pockets of women compared to the pockets of men, it does contribute positively to food, household food consumption or nutrition. reason being mainly women do make decisions on what to produce or actually what to prepare for the household. And then we have the negative pathway where we know that a livestock can contribute to increased exposure of the pathogens, animal pathogens and foodborne diseases. And we have seen actually foodborne diseases contributing to greater health, negative health impacts, which are some cases much more than HIV/AIDS or other, known diseases. So these are the main pathways: the own production pathway, the women empowerment pathway, income pathway, which are more positive, and then we have the exposure to pathogens and foodborne diseases. So moving from there, then we go to Rwanda, a case study, which is in the Girinka project, which is a government project that gives livestock to poor households. And we just want to see the challenge. This is because Rwanda has a chronic malnutrition. So I'm a human nutritionist, and we do link the human nutrition and the livestock issues. And for example, in Rwanda, we have 40% of the children stunted. Stunting means that the children are exposed to chronic long-term inadequate consumption of quantities in terms of amount, but also quality in terms of micronutrients. And therefore, children, when they are measured, how they are growing, their age versus their height, you find that they are too short for their height. And that's what we call stunting, when the child is too short for their age. And if we compare to Kenya, for example, where we are based, I am based, for Kenya, we have about 26% of the children, based on the latest KHS finding, about 26% of those children being stunted. And therefore, you see it's about almost double cases of malnutrition in Rwanda. And therefore, the government put in mechanisms to see how to address. And we find that 70% of the children below the age of 5 do not meet their intake in terms of quality and also quantity. So they are not taking enough calories, but also they are not taking enough nutrients that need to support their adequate growth and development. And we are saying that animal source foods do provide a mechanism that supplies energy and protein and micronutrients. And what we've always said, for example, if you were to consume a glass of milk, about 200 ml of milk, you would get a lot of nutrients in there, from fat soluble nutrients, macro and micronutrients in terms of fat and protein, but also vitamins and minerals that are important for growth. And therefore, we appreciate that animal source foods are an important contribution to the growth and development, especially in African countries where malnutrition cases are higher. And the debate is then, how do we balance this? How do we then sustainably produce animal source foods within the planetary boundaries? So then we address malnutrition, but at the same time, we address welfare, animal welfare, and the climate change issues. And also in Uganda, 1 out of 5 children, well, only just like 1 out of 5 were consuming fresh or powdered milk. And this just gives us the challenge. So we appreciate the scenario. And therefore then next slide indicates the government of Rwanda then initiated the Girinka program, whereby 1 cow per poor household was given as a transfer. And this implementation started from the year 2006 and ongoing. And so far, by the time we were doing our project in 2021, about 130 livestock had been distributed. And therefore for ILRI, we did want to see how does the consumption change when we have a social behavior change communication intervention implemented. And what we are saying that when we are looking at the pathways, if the pathways in isolation of social behavior change, then they do not automatically translate into improved nutrition and health. Because what we've seen in most cases, you find households can produce so much milk and they sell everything. They can produce chicken or eggs and they sell everything. So when we are looking at production in isolation of messaging around the importance of consumption of the right foods, then if these interventions are not done, then we still do not find it translating most of the time into improved nutrition, and therefore we added the additional component of social behavior change to increase consumption of milk more generally, more specifically, but animal source foods more generally because of their benefits to the young children who are aged between 1 year and 59 months or 5 years. Next, we did find that I will not go into the details of how the intervention was done, but we did have a control and intervention arm where we intensified nutrition messaging, and the other non-intervention arm, we left them just to see. They were just receiving the normal government messaging that they would get. So we did see an increase in nutrition knowledge and awareness by the mothers, but we also saw an increase in consumption of milk and other animal source foods in a more increased frequency. Initially, they would consume like once a week. So we saw an increase in frequency. There wasn't so much increase in terms of quantity, but the positive was that the frequency increased, and overall, of course, the quantity would increase if we were to look at in a week, for example. We also saw an increase in fathers' knowledge and awareness, and therefore they did contribute to supporting nutrition of the children. Why? Because most of the interventions tend to target women and leave out men, forgetting that most of in the African setups, the households are, patriarchal, and there is an important role of the men play in either resource allocation or decision making in terms of what is consumed or what is purchased. And therefore, the intervention then targeted men as, as opposed to other interventions that only targeted women as the caregivers. And of course, we did see an increase in dietary diversity. We had a group of 7 food groups that are recommended by WHO, UNICEF to be consumed in a day. And children, for better dietary diversity, they need to consume about 4, at minimum 4 out of the 7 food groups, and we did see an increase in the dietary diversity score. So what did we learn from this? The next and final slide, we see that the Girinka program did contribute to the food and nutrition outcomes. And we are saying that even without social behavior interventions, the household food security of the intervention group was better than the non-beneficiaries, that is those that were not receiving the cow. And then we did see an improved food security as a beneficial effect on child nutrition outcomes. So when there is improved food security at the household level, by proxy, then children do benefit because the proportion of what children consume really comes from the household level. And then the other lesson we learned that it is important that the component on livestock production best practices need to be incorporated to improve productivity of the cows. This is the production component of it, whereby the feed and animal issues need to be addressed so that we increase productivity. And therefore, the results show that engaging men in nutrition to increase gender equity and household joint decision making does improve animal source food consumption. And just to summarize, really, this is giving us an idea of how livestock interventions can contribute to animal source food increase in consumption, but also ultimately contribute to nutrition outcomes. We did not measure nutrition outcomes. We used consumption patterns as a proxy, but we are saying, yes, we need to go further into that. And Dr. Njuguna's earlier presentation said that we need to map and see who consumes the meat or the animal source foods. And from the nutrition perspective, we say that it is important that consumption of animal source foods are targeted more towards children who are growing because they need they are at a greater need for nutritional growth, and they are nutritionally vulnerable. So even as we're looking at who needs to consume this, then let's also focus more on the children and also women, especially those who are lactating and pregnant because of their increased maternal nutritional demands. So over to you, Zoe, for the next case study. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Esther. Esther, do you want me to
Yes.
try the video?
Yeah. Yes.
For both
yes,
of these
please.
little stories that we're telling today, everyone, there are 2 short videos and actually a podcast for the second one. And we can try to share with you. It's a bit short, but it might also not work. Let me do this. I'll share the link in the chat. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay. We won't
Yeah, it looks like it's
stretch
still loading.
technology.
Okay.
Do you want me to try?
Yeah, sure, try.
Okay. Please, everyone, I encourage you to be really active in the chat. And if you can't hear or this isn't working really quickly, then we'll just share the link in the chat. Okay. I think let's share the link in the chat. Yeah. I want to talk about, which actually is going to take us out of Rwanda and back to Kenya, specifically a study in Siaya County in Western Kenya. So in this particular area, most households are keeping chickens, and this is definitely smallholder type scenario. Most households, similar to the one shown in the picture, have adult chickens. And in this scenario, also, I guess, also thinking about animal welfare, the involuntary losses are very, very high, about 60%. So this means that the people owning the chickens are not able to decide, oh, we'd like to sell this chicken, or we'd like to slaughter the chicken. The 60% offtake is chickens being killed by diseases, primarily one called Newcastle disease. All the vets will know about that for sure. And then also predation. So again, if chickens don't have housing, they're more susceptible to predators. So I guess this questions a little bit, makes me think the narrative that a free range or a smallholder scenario for livestock is always more humane. If predators and diseases are coming for you all the time, that's also not great. And in this area, also as Esther described, this Western Kenya, and there's also pretty high prevalence of stunting, although not as high as the area with the Garinka project in Rwanda. About a quarter of children are, again, below their growth scores that would be expected for their age. So in this study, basically, we said, okay, it's unlike the Garinka program. It's not always possible to give out livestock. There's not always a government program, but how can we help people protect the livestock with data collected quarterly at households? So longitudinal data, that's very exciting for any research. Would be visited by an agricultural extension technician every 3 months who would vaccinate their chickens for Newcastle disease. And then in the control households, they would still receive some extension material and some dewormers, but no vaccine. So again, half the households are being vaccinated for Newcastle disease. And meanwhile, the study is also collecting information about consumption, but also about growth scores. And remember, this is happening over time. So this all happened over the course of about a year and a half. And the very, very exciting thing from this study is, again, as Esther described, there are a lot of, I'll say it this way. The exciting thing about this study is that in the control households, boys and girls had improved growth scores. So again, better scores for their height and their weight according to their age, which is very, very exciting to us because, again, we showed in that original slide that there are a lot of negative pathways for nutrition in livestock. If you're a child and that could contribute to more diarrheal disease incidents. There are a lot of potential negative things as well. So basically what this showed is that a very small intervention increased the flock size for households by 1 chicken. And this is why I'll share a link in the chat. There's a little podcast that also talks about this study. So the average flock improved growth scores in a way that the study was able to measure. And also significantly, these improvements were for both boys and girls. And I say this because in some other studies in Western Kenya, girls are actually more vulnerable to having lower growth. Don't know exactly what that's about. I'm sure you can imagine possibly some different ideas about what boys and girls should be eating, some perhaps preferential treatment within the household about animal source foods going to boys or higher quality foods going to boys possibly. But we know that in Western Kenya in previous studies, girls had worse than boys. So it's very exciting that in this specific intervention, protecting livestock that people already had, were able to help both boys and girls in terms of their growth. And if anyone wants to go and look for it, also this has been published. So again, other researchers, if you want to read about that, you can find it. Also a little video which I'll share in the chat. And woohoo.
Esther, please just hold on online. We have one more presentation, then we'll have a discussion and a question and answer session. Our last discussion for our presentation for today is coming from down south, from Fort House in South Africa. It will be done by Fiona Miles, and it's entitled Meat Exhaustion Day, when meat is eating up the planet. And so I'll just request Siliwe or Fiona to share their screen and pick up the discussion from there. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Fiona Miles. I represent Four Paws Animal Welfare Foundation in South Africa. Just a little bit of background. Four Paws is a global animal welfare organization. Our focus is animals that are under human control, and we cover a range of topics from wild animals to farm animals and companion animals. And today I have the opportunity to present the work of Four Paws in terms of having a look at our report, Meat Exhaustion Day, when meat is eating up the planet. It's an interesting point of view and an interesting report, and it really sort of sets some limitations and helps us to look at it from a global perspective. So now we're zooming out a little bit from where the other speakers were focused on certain areas. So what is Meat Exhaustion Day, and why are we speaking about it today? The main question that we pose to ourselves is, does meat consumption fit within the planetary boundaries and health recommendations? And basically the short answer is no. So to answer the question, Four Paws calculated the Meat Exhaustion Day, which basically goes along the same lines as the Earth Overshoot Day, which marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what Earth can generate or regenerate in that year. So Meat Exhaustion Day is the day on which the maximum recommended meat consumption in terms of sustainability and health impacts is reached based on current average consumption of meat per day. According to the research results, the global average meat consumption is way beyond what is healthy or sustainable. And this is particularly true in high income and global north countries. The US and Australia have already exceeded the recommended amount of meat consumption during the month of March this year, while in Europe, the day was reached in April. And from that point of view, the remainder of the year is still upon us. And so we're looking at billions of animals still to be consumed. To be in line with the planetary boundaries, meat intake needs to be reduced by more than 70% in regions of high-income countries and the global north. Four Paws is urging governments and industries to support a swift reduction of meat production and consumption and an end to factory farming and a transition towards food systems that support animal welfare, human health standards, care for the environment, and that enable ecological restoration. Go to the next slide, please. So obviously, industrially produced meat products becomes extremely cheap, and therefore increasingly and ever-growingly the consumption of meat poses hidden costs in terms of human health, animal welfare, global climate change, and of course a loss of biodiversity. The crisis at hand here is feeding Africa's growing population, whilst there's obviously a demand for greater animal products. As for PAWS, our interest is the suffering of billions of animals, and we need to ensure that farmed animals live a good life, whilst we ensure that we transform the global food systems. A change in food systems and a reduction of meat consumption is needed to bring our general food consumption in balance with the carrying capacity of the planet. So there was a comparison of the average meat consumption of global regions against the planetary health diet. And one can see then the planetary health diet sets the line. And primarily the southern, let's say African countries still remain below that for I think many reasons already provided. But there's a huge responsibility on the global north to make some significant changes. Thank you. Factory farming commodifies animals for profits and causes deforestation, as well as obviously other environmental pollution and contamination issues. The sort of the chain reaction, if I can put it that way, is really huge. And so FORPAWS was wanting to have a look at why this report would be important to us. And it gives us a reference and an argument in terms of animal welfare issues and how these issues are interconnected with not only environmental damage and the climate crisis, but of course human and animal well-being. So wildlife extinction, meat production and factory farming, and of course animal abuse are all interconnected. Ultimately, what we are saying is that by stopping factory farming, land that is used to produce feed can be reforested and rewilded and can have significant positive impacts for climate-related issues. Public health, of course, is deeply affected. You can keep it on the same. Thank you. Public health is deeply affected as factory farmed meat is produced in a way that threatens environmental health through pollution and spread of disease. Crowded factory farms create ideal conditions for the spread of zoonotic diseases, such as swine flu. In addition, obviously, antibiotics and hormones that are excessively used in this type of farming have a huge impact on health and health risks. And the research, and they reach communities through contamination of water and soil. Factory farmed meat is also overconsumed, which affects the health of individuals who are adopting poor diets. The consumption of unprocessed and processed red meat is associated with coronary heart disease, diabetes, and stroke, and processed meat is also considered carcinogenic to humans. Meanwhile, the protein that we do derive from meat can be derived from healthier foods that have extremely lower environmental impacts and cause less to no animal suffering, such as legumes and nuts. By shifting from unhealthy diets to one described by the planetary health diet, 11 million premature adult deaths can be prevented each year. Furthermore, billions of animals and the suffering that they are subject to can also be seen to decline. Thank you. So the report also strengthens our position on the need to reduce global meat consumption with a strong focus on holding the global north accountable. This year, the Meat Exhaustion Day was reached globally on the 26th of June, which was very close to the Earth Overshoot Day, which was the 27th, which is the 27th of July. To stay within health and planetary boundaries, global meat consumption should be reduced by 51.6%. Since not everyone on the planet is consuming the same amount of meat, regional and country-specific data helps better determine where meat reduction should occur. And this information is detailed in our meat exhaustion report. Furthermore, please, I'd ask everyone to have a look at our most recently published report on zoonotic diseases and zoonosis to see how these factors all impact on one another. In summary, the global north should reduce its meat production and consumption by up to 80%. The Planetary Health Diet Guideline of eating no more than 300 grams of meat a week is therefore necessary within the high-income countries where food costs and access to food can positively be managed by governments and retailers and producers. The governments and market actors should take a lead and follow the recommendations of the diet to influence consumer behavior. It is really important that we look at the intersection of human, animal, and environmental health and hold those accountable that are over-consuming and overproducing and provide the necessary for those that have, of course, much less impact in this area and have a greater need. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona, for that presentation. And I think it's time for us to open up for questions and answer. So those with any concerns in the 3 presentations that have been done, or even in the earlier ones, this is your opportunity. And as you plan, I just want to read 1 or 2 things that have come from the online participants. My good friend Mwenda Mbaka says, Dr. Jane Juguna is spot on about the issues of negligible carbon footprint. However, the elephant in the house is how to improve the food and nutrition deficiencies throughout Africa, which can be addressed through animal-sourced foods without worsening our contribution to the global carbon footprints, among other ills of livestock production. Dr. Omani Janet, with ever-growing population and subsequent demand for food, urban farming has been growing each day. It may be true that cumulatively this may be contributing to many animal welfare, environmental, and public health concerns. Doreen Lugalia, another good friend of mine, says, any insights of fish farming, especially fish cage, with respect to welfare? And I've looked at the corner where the animal welfare fellows are sitting, and we'll see whether they'll give us an answer. Sol Chemungens, I would like to thank the organizers behind the Africa Protein Summit. The presentations are very informative and engaging. I come from an animal health background, vet surgeon, and I did my PhD in proteomics. Hey, that is tough. At the University of Queensland, and then he goes to explain a few things around that. Mwenda then talks about great arguments from Esther. I hope, Esther, you are listening. I take note that you acknowledge that malnutrition is widespread despite the traditional practice where the poor rely on non-animal sources of protein and other foods. I wish to add that plenty of land which cannot be practically utilized to produce crops sustainably, such as the arid and semi-arid areas of Africa, are better suited for production of animal-sourced foods. Last, Janet Omani says, again, I think in response to Esther's presentation, that cultural practices in regards to traditional gender roles are still at work in Western Kenya, hence the difference in the boy and girl child nutrition. So as you can see, it's a complex that we are discussing here. And if you then throw in gender, and throw in public health, and throw in animal production, and then throw in the various ecological systems, then you have a lot of things to talk about. But let me not be speaking too much and allow people on the floor to ask questions or comments. Esther, if you want to make a comment on what the observations from the 2 that I've read online, this is your chance.
Okay, yeah, I was just saying that it is a complex issue, and a welcome comment about utilizing those non-agricultural or non-crop production areas for extensive livestock or chicken production. I think it's something that we need to really bring in with evidence and inform policy to see how we can change those areas. But also we remark that in those dry areas where the arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya, for example, chicken or egg poultry production is very low because of the social cultural issues. They are really seen like birds and really small, not worth consuming, but there's been a lot of social behavior change communication raising the nutritional benefits of egg, for example, and in a bid to increase its consumption and change those perceptions. So a point well taken. And also the other important component between the gender dynamics. Zoe is a gender expert and maybe she can come in, but we do see a lot of variations in intra-household food distribution, for example. And we do see changes or differences in nutrition outcomes. Nutrition tends to lean more towards women and children. Why? Because we have the 1,000 window of opportunity where we say that malnutrition starts intrauterine when the mother is expecting and the brain of the child doesn't develop if the nutrition is not proper for the mother. And therefore, we tend to focus more on the pregnant and lactating because of the physiological needs, and also for the children under 5 because that's when their growth is more important and it's highest. And if they are malnourished and beyond the age of 5, we may not reverse the damages done by malnutrition, especially in brain development. So then the focus then tends towards more in women and children. But we are saying it's a complex issue where we bring in gender because we cannot feed women and children in isolation of men. They need to appreciate why this needs to happen, and they are the pass bearers. So really important to do all these balances. And as we say, it's really a complex framework that every discipline needs to come in and support to see how do we produce within planetary boundaries, how do we ensure that the right person is consuming the nutritious foods, how do we address the gender barriers and the like. Thanks. I don't know if Zoe, you want to quickly come in?
No, I don't have anything else to add unless there's a specific question. You said it well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Zoe and Esther. Any questions from the ground? Participants here? Any comments, questions? Professor Mwinde, where is the mic? Professor here wants to make a
comment from one of the online participants on the role of gender. So we are doing a study of poultry value chain in Kiambu. So the situation is the same. As much as the dominant player in terms of poultry production is the women, when it comes to marketing and the actual income and decision is about men. So I think maybe as a follow-up to the pathways they presented, it's worth to see how does this affect then dietary diversity of the children and other vulnerable groups in households, and therefore the overall nutrition of the households.
Thank you, Prof. Any comments, questions? Since while people are still thinking, I want to pick something with you, Fiona. In one of your slides, you talk about recommended meat consumption for planetary health is 43 grams per day. And I know South Africans, just like Kenyans, eat a whole kilo of meat in one sitting. How do we reconcile the two? And I'm asking this because of a friend of mine in media who's been looking at me badly. So any comments, Fiona? Are you still there, Fiona? Okay, looks like they have disappeared. Anyway, it's something to think about.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in.
Jump in.
Yes, from the nutrition perspective, the amount of protein in a day is 9 grams per kg body weight. And this is meat, milk, beans, and all that. So generally, we tend to say that what you can use or an easy way that we explain to the layman or laywoman, person is you need to consume, your meat should be like your palm size. And palm size from the fingers downwards, not the fingers upwards. That is a simple guide to guide you how much meat you can consume or it's recommended to consume per day. Of course, hands vary and all that, but just that indicates how little that we need to consume. And when you look at it in the Kenyan perspective, on a typical Friday out, followed by a Sunday out, a Saturday out, you find that we eat several hands or palm sizes, which strains the kidney to, to process, to digest, and all those. So, in the Kenyan perspective, those are the general guidelines that we give to a lay person to help in consuming meat. This is recognizing that there are other protein sources that also come from other, both animal and plant-based, that can contribute to your overall protein intake in a day.
Thank you very much, Esther. The room has looked at me so badly. It's good you are not here. But now they know, from a nutritionist point of view, all the meat you should eat is your palm size. So go home and evaluate what you've been doing. And you heard what Esther said, that because we know that there are alternative proteins and other sources that you should be eating. Yeah. And those alternative proteins are what we'll be discussing tomorrow. Because tomorrow we'll be talking about basic human nutrition policy provisions in Kenya. Then we'll do a knowledge, attitudes, and practices in protein consumption in Kenya. Then we'll move to current trends and practices on family protein consumption. Practicing nutritionist view, and you've just had a snapshot of what a nutritionist is saying. Then we'll do alternative proteins for Africa. And then sustainable alternative sources of proteins, benefits, challenges, and opportunities. And then we'll have another presentation on promoting alternative proteins through vegan school lunch in Uganda, the experience of some of our friends in Uganda. And last but not least, we'll then look at sowing the seeds of change towards a more just and inclusive food system in South Africa. And I think the principles apply to the Eastern Africa. The principles are relatively the same. In the afternoon, we'll be having a session to develop the communique, which will be led by Dr. Patrick Mwinde. He's the expert of communiques. I'm just the expert of speaking. They say mimi ndio msemaji wa shirika. Yep. And so essentially, ladies and gentlemen, we are saying that unless there's a burning question, we have come to the end of the morning session. Lunch will be served, and I'm trying to see whether Sharon is behind there. Mwinde, please give Sharon the mic so that she tells us where lunch will be served. For the people online, this is it for the day. I know some of you would like to participate in developing the communique. A draft will be done, and it will be shared with you for you to input into it. If you have strong opinions around what needs to go into the communique, please email us. You can email me. Then we'll share it to the team that is looking at it. Unfortunately, it's been a bit difficult trying to ensure that we stay online for the better part of the day. And with those few remarks, I want to say thank you very much for turning up. Thank you for our online participants for the active participation. As you can see, this is a wide topic that we cannot do and finish. So there'll be a series of webinars. Our head of comms, Lucy, confirms and agrees that we'll do a series of webinars between now and December, just to keep the conversation going. Follow us on our social media platforms, raise any issues that you have. As we said, we are not the experts and we don't know it all, but we'd like to hear from you and have that conversation going on. Over to Sharon to tell the people here what lunch is like. And remember, it's palm-sized meat.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. So it's time to take a break and have our meal. Lunch will just be served outside here. You can kindly pick a card from me for the lunch meal so that you can enjoy the lunch together. Thank you and enjoy the lunch.